Hey everybody, it's me, Amy, here with another wonderfully informative Dueling Rabbits Productions video about weaving on Swedish draw looms. Today's topic is Adventures in Doubleweave. As a damask weaver primarily, I find that Doubleweave requires a different sort of thinking when warping the loom and considering best use of the pattern shafts. In anticipation of a coverlet I'm planning to weave someday, I decided to troubleshoot the process with a narrow sample of cloth to work out any kinks in the setup and weaving. In this video, I'm going to share some of my experiences and talk about the ways in which Doubleweave differs from more conventional drawloom structures. The draft for my sample is adapted from a classic Doubleweave coverlet in 5 plain weave blocks. The recipe may be found in the treasure chest of Swedish weaving. For my money, one of the most inspirational weaving books ever published. It's out of print, but not too difficult to find. If this sort of weaving is in your wheelhouse, I recommend you grab a copy without delay. The piece as presented in the book is woven on a loom fitted with the old Glamocra Opemta accessory. I used my draw loom with its mirrorhead pattern shaft attachment. The draft requires 10 pattern shafts, 4 ground shafts, and 4 treadles. The book is a little scant on setup details, so a good deal needs to be inferred. I'll talk more about that setup in a bit. Here's a Fiberworks profile for the coverlet's central pattern, which I adapted for my narrow double weave sample. You can see the traditional pine trees at the bottom and the monk's belt-like flower motifs. Although the pattern looks quite complex, a cursory analysis reveals that this is, indeed, only a 5-block pattern. There's blocks 1, 2, 3, 4, which is doubled here, and 5, which is also doubled. Patterns such as these work best when 2 highly contrasting colors are used. I am doing my sample in orange and yellow, somewhat non-traditional colors for such things, but I had the 8-2 cotton in my stash and decided to use it. The threading for the piece requires that the warp alternates 1 orange thread and 1 yellow thread all the way across. We'll look at this requirement in more detail a little further on. But now, let's sally forth to the drawloom to see how warping for double weave is similar to and different from setup for more usual structures such as damask. Here I am, preparing to beam the warp chains. The warp is wound in a 2x2 cross, alternating orange and yellow threads. Because it's double weave, the set is twice as close as normal. For these 480 8-2 cotton threads, I rough slayed my reed at 40 ends per inch for a 12-inch wide piece. The warp is beamed as usual. Here you can see the path from the tie-on rod at the back to the workout weights at the front. The warp is then tensioned over the trapeze, goes under the footrest, over the breast beam, and through the reed. I wind on the warp in my customary fashion, packed with loads of warping sticks. Now, once the warp is beamed, one has to stop and think. Ordinarily, if you're following the mirrorhead method, which I always do, all the pattern shafts are hung from 1 or possibly 2 bars at the back of the loom for threading thusly. The threads are grouped into units, or leashes, weighted with a lingo each. It's really quick work to do it this way, and mistakes are easy to correct. Pattern heddles are not distributed onto the pattern shafts until after the warp has been tied at the front of the loom, several steps down the road. However, this strategy is problematic with double weave, and an examination of the pattern shaft threading shows us why. Here on the right, I have my 10 pattern shafts. 1 is at the back, and 10 is at the front of the loom. Across the top are my blocks. Recall that there are 5. Let's look at block 1 in more detail. You can see that it has 4 threads, 2 orange and 2 yellow, alternating. Orange, yellow, orange, yellow. The 2 orange threads are on shaft 1, and the 2 yellow threads are on shaft 2. Block 2 is threaded the same way, with alternating orange and yellow threads. Orange is on shaft 3, and yellow is on shaft 4. We continue along, 2 orange threads and 2 yellow threads alternating on all 10 pattern shafts until our 5 blocks are drafted in whatever order we require. Now, with 5 blocks, this piece could be woven quite efficiently on a 20-shaft loom, 4 shafts per block, 2 for each layer. But because of the multiplying effect of a Drawloom's pattern shafts, this piece can be woven on half that number, plus 4 additional ground shafts. With only 2 rather than 4 additional shafts required for each pattern block, you can see how easy it is to add additional blocks to our design. I should add at this point that this is not the only way to thread a Drawloom for double weave. You can pair the warp threads by color rather than alternate them, which has both benefits and disadvantages. If you're interested in finding out more about this approach, as well as more about double weave and Drawlooms generally, I recommend you get yourself a copy of one of the most invaluable weaving books ever, Pattern Techniques for Hand Weavers. But back to the problem at hand, how to get these split units of alternating threads onto the correct pattern shafts. The usual strategy of weighting complete units with a lingo each is impractical with this arrangement. At the very least, each 4-thread unit would require 2 lingos, one for the orange threads and one for the yellow, hung in pairs and skipping alternate threads to make moving the units onto the pattern shafts possible. I actually tried threading this way for about 5 minutes before giving up in despair. I also thought seriously about threading my units onto 5 pattern shafts so that I'd only have to move half the number of threads later on. But this method proved to be confusing and I found myself dreading the redistribution to come. After several such experiments, I decided to take the advice of Joanne Hall and Mary Jean Martin, who, among others, have suggested threading the pattern shafts in situ at the back of the loom. It makes a lot of sense to do it this way, using the same setup as on a single harness loom with the 10 pattern shafts hung just in front of the back beam. I actually find it easier than a conventional 10-shaft threading, because there's so much room inside the extension to get comfortable and move things around for ergonomic perfection. So what do we use for weight instead of lingos? Well, some weavers don't weigh the pattern heddles at all at this stage of the process, but I like to have a bit of resistance against which to thread. I continued to think of these shafts in a conventional way and weighted them with spare shaft bars. If you don't have enough extra bars, you can use metal rods. Welding rods work, I'm told, as do garden stakes. You could also hang individual weights to groups of threads on each shaft once they are where they need to be. I like using my shaft bars because I can employ my big safety pins to make sure the heddles don't slide off if the worst happens. Here's a view from the inside of the loom about halfway through the threading. You can clearly see the alternating orange and yellow threads in their 4-thread units. I wound the warp in a 2x2 cross, as you can see, mostly because I didn't want to go to the trouble of rewinding my only 2 cones of yarn, but I would probably wind 4 threads in future. Here you can see I'm threading block 1. There's the orange threads going through the heddles on shaft 1 furthest back, and the yellow threads through the heddles on shaft 2 in front of it. Now the threading of the pattern shafts is complete. You can see the profile draft reflected in units distributed across all 10 shafts. Now that that job is done, I return to the regularly scheduled program. Countermarch is moved to just in front of the pattern shafts so the long eye heddles can be threaded. You can see here how roomy it is inside the loom and how clearly the threads on the pattern shafts can be seen. The ground shafts are threaded in a straight threading, and with the pairs of colored threads in their units of 4, mistakes are easy to see. Another very fast, efficient process that's over before you know it. The threading of both harnesses is now complete. I slay my reed in place, 4 threads per dent in a 10 dents per inch reed, which will give me 20 ends per inch in each layer of the cloth. You can see how tightly packed the threads are. I drop the reed down on the knotted warp and then move it and the entire countermarch forward so I can mount the reed in the beater. I did this off camera since I find it can be a fairly fraught process on the Drawloom. So here we are. It actually went more smoothly than expected, which I suspect may have something to do with the fact that the threads are not as tightly packed as they would be if the pattern shafts were all bunched together on one bar as usual. I've done a rough tie-on, as you can see. I've brought my ground shafts up to the front so they're in good shape. Warp looks pretty nice, the tension is even, and now I'm ready to think about placement of the pattern shafts. It's a pretty simple matter to take each shaft off the supports one at a time, bring it forward, and attach it to the draw cords hanging from the console, up to there. An important consideration at this stage is how to weight the lower shaft bars so they are stable during the move. Here you can see two shafts after they've been moved forward into place using the strategy I found to be optimal. For insurance, I've got safety strings strung on each of the bars. You can't really see them because they're on the other side, but the knots are visible at the ends. I then used double lift heddles to hang 3 lingos close to both sides of the warp on each shaft. This makes them very easy to move without fear of tipping or sliding. And here's the proof of the pudding. The shafts are easily movable by one person without too much fuss. I simply remove each shaft from the supports, slide it forward on the warp, rest it on the side bars, and then attach the hooks at the ends of the shafts to the weighting draw cords. And here's another one, just to prove that last was no accident. I moved all 10 shafts in just a few minutes with no errors or threading mishaps. When that's done, I check to see that the weights are working well and that all the shafts return to neutral as required without getting hung up on anything. Success! So here's the final setup. It's interesting to see the pattern shafts in a configuration other than my usual repeated point threading. Next step, tie-up. I use the Vevstuga method, as you can see, and elastics on the long lambs to ensure the shafts snap back to neutral obediently when their treadles are released. The tie-up is simplicity itself. 4 treadles with only 2 connections per shaft, 1 lifting and 1 sinking. So before we start to weave, let's remind ourselves how the pattern shafts are set up. You can see that the front of the loom is off to our left. We're looking at the pattern shafts straight on from the sides. We'll ignore these back 2 shafts for now. Those are threaded for borders and I haven't decided how they're going to work, but the remaining 10 shafts are threaded with their 5 blocks. Let's look at block 1. The orange threads are on the right and the yellow threads are on the left. There's shaft 1 with orange and there's shaft 2 with yellow. If we pick up shaft 1, you'll see that only orange threads are going up. And if we pick shaft 2 up, we'll see that only yellow threads are going up. That's block 1. The remaining 4 blocks are threaded similarly on the remaining 8 shafts. So now let's see what that looks like at the front of the loom. Here we are looking at the pull handles on the console. We'll ignore these 2 pull handles on the right because they're for the as yet unresolved borders and concentrate on the remaining 10. Here's block 1, which is on shafts 1 and 2 at the back of the loom. Orange is on the right, yellow is on the left. Blocks 2, 3, 4, and 5 are the same. If I pull back, you can see that I have only used the central 12 of my 40-odd pull handles. The draw cords for those pulls are just wrapped around the top of the loom. So let's look at the weaving in progress so we can see how this works. I've had a few false starts and there were some mistakes in my draft, but it's improving now and the setup has shaken out really well. Let's concentrate on this little monk's belt-like flower that is being woven here. If we look at what's just been done, it's easier to see what's going on. If we look at the block that's showing yellow, here, here, and here, that's block 4. To weave it, I would go to my block 4 pull handles, pull the yellow one, and raise those threads, just like that. It's easier to see if I put some paper behind it. So there they are, those yellow threads are up. But I also need those orange blocks in between to go up to the top of my shed. That's block 5. So I go to my block 5 pull handles, pull up the orange one, and there we go. The monk's belt motif is complete. You can see it better up above. There's my yellow and orange threads showing. But I need to complete the top of my shed. All the rest of the threads need to be orange as well. So I go to the rest of my blocks, 1, 2, and 3, and pull the orange handles. The top of my shed is now complete, as you can see. The underside, of course, is exactly the opposite. Where orange shows on top, yellow will show on the bottom, and vice versa. This is the console setup for that row. Here's my orange shaft pulled for block 1, my orange shaft pulled for block 2, for block 3, and for block 5. The only yellow shaft that's been pulled is for block 4. You'll notice that for each and every block, one and only one shaft has been pulled. And this is how the lift plan works. I've got my blocks 1 through 5, and for each block I have 2 columns representing the orange and yellow shafts. This is the row we've just set up right under the post-it. You can see I've got orange pulled for blocks 1, 2, and 3, yellow pulled for block 4, and orange pulled for block 5. Let's see what the next row holds in store. This is the center of that monk's belt flower, and you can see it's the same. Orange is pulled for blocks 1, 2, and 3. But for block 4, now orange is pulled rather than yellow, so I have to make that change. Block 5 is yellow rather than orange, so I need to make that change too. And now I'll treadle my unit alternating orange and yellow picks. I always start with orange. There's 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that middle part of my monk's belt motif is complete. Now I'm going to weave back out the other side of the motif. I'm swapping out orange and yellow for blocks 5 and 4 again. On 4, orange goes down and yellow goes up, and on 5, yellow goes down and orange goes up. And I'm going to treadle 1, 2, 3, 4 again. And I actually know without looking that I'm going to have to do the same thing a second time. So I'll repeat those 4 picks with the same pulls. And you can see now that that little monk's belt flower is really starting to take shape. Okay, that's those 2 done, so now I will go on. I can see that I have to swap out orange and yellow on blocks 5 and 4 again. So I'll go ahead and make those changes. Now I'll treadle 1, 2, 3, and 4. Common sense tells me that I'll probably have to do that again, and yes, I do. So I'll treadle 1, 2, 3, 4 again, and that will finish out the motif. So that's 5 block double weave on the Drawloom with 10 pattern shafts. Most of the troubleshooting is done, so I'm going to continue sampling with different weft yarns, border treatments, patterns, and sets until my warp is all used up. And while I weave, I'm going to dream about the coverlet I plan to make someday.